Perfect. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Allie W. I'm from Yarn Inspirations, and we're here today with Tamara from Mowgli Blog, and we have a fantastic class to kick off your 2023 with. So we have the Chunky Plush Big Throw. I will let Tamara tell you the actual pattern name here in a moment, but if you have any questions throughout today's class, please feel free to drop them in the chat and I will get as many questions as I can over to Tamara. And I will turn things over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Allie. So hi, everybody. I'm Tamara from Mowgli. Thank you so much for joining me and happy 2023. Now, the official name for the pattern we are making today is the Bernat Mesh Crochet Blanket. So if you need to look that up later, you'll find that on yarnspirations.com. Bernat Mesh Crochet Blanket. And here is a copy of that printout. There's the picture right there. You can see the original was made in pewter, which is sort of a light gray for this yarn. Today, we're going to be using this one, which is Foggy Teal. I had to turn it around so I could see the color name. Isn't that pretty? This is such a unique yarn. Now, I know it's showing up really blue on camera. It's one of those colors, something about teal and aqua. They always want to show up really blue on camera. This one actually has a lot more green in it in person. At least I think so. You can see already it's really different. It's really thick. It's kind of tubular. We're going to take a closer look at that here at the hand camera in just a minute. But for a great big yarn like this, you do need a great big hook. So in addition to the yarn today, we are using a 25 millimeter crochet hook. That is also known as a US 50, but it's always best to go by millimeters. When you're looking for a crochet hook, you want a 25 millimeter crochet hook for this one. These, not necessarily this one, but other 25 millimeter crochet hooks should be available at your local Michaels. And here is a small sample of that blanket pattern. This is a really simple pattern. If you have not been able to find a great big hook like this, you could probably try and do it with your fingers. Additionally, inside the label, which we'll take a look at here in a minute, there's also a great pattern for a table knit blanket with this yarn. So if you really can't find the hook, but you really want to use it, you've got a couple of options. So let's go ahead and bring on the hand camera so we can take a closer look at this yarn here. Alrighty, let me move that pattern out of the way here. This is the yarn. Now, when you go to Google this yarn, if you need to go look it up, or if you're trying to search for it on Michaels, you'll want to look for Bernat Plush Big. And Plush Big is one word. That's the tricky part. That's what makes it hard to search. But as long as you write Plush Big as one word, it'll be easy enough to find. Now, you can see here, this is a jumbo 7-weight yarn. Definitely very thick. The thing about jumbos is there's a great variety in there. Some are thicker than others. This one is about this thick right here. You can see a bit thinner around than my pinky. And you can tell from the outside that it's squishy. Let's get that to focus a little bit better there. But it's kind of like a little knit tube. And then this is what you'll see on the inside. Gotta hold my hand up here so I can focus. You guys see that? It is so fuzzy. It's all these little strings right inside the yarn. So because the outside tube here is, I believe, machine knit, certainly don't think anybody's doing it by hand. But we've got a lot of great stretch to the yarn this way. And it's also got a ton of squish this way. So it's just really unique and a whole lot of fun. Now, of course, when the ends look like this after you cut them, we're not going to be able to just weave them in like we do your standard, other yarns. We're going to want to sew these in. So I'm going to cover that in this class as well. Just a little bit more on the yarn since it is a new one. It is 100% polyester, and each skein has 45 yards. So to make the full-size blanket that we're making today, you would need 10 balls. I'm not going to use 10 balls today, but you would need 10 balls of it to make the full-size blanket. The great thing about this pattern is that you can also make it in other sizes. It's very simple, and we'll be going over that here in just a moment. I did mention that there is a pattern on the inside of the label as well. And that is for that table knit plush blanket. So you've got another great alternative right on the label that doesn't need a hook. Like I say, if you really want to get started on something and you can't find the hook, you've got a couple of great options there. So here's another look at that written pattern. It's got the yarn information and the hook information and more information about the yarn. It's a wonderful pattern because it has written instructions and charted. The one thing it doesn't include is the stitch multiple, but it's really easy. you can start with a chain, any multiple of 2. So as long as it's an even number of stitches that you chain, you'll be all set. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to set that aside, and we're going to go ahead and start stitching. But before I do, are there any questions I can answer on the yarn itself?
I don't see any questions right now.
Okay, great. Now, the way this skein is wound, this one I've opened up and I've been practicing with already. This one's still all wound up with its label on here. You can see how the ends of the yarn crisscross. So that means I want to pull this one from the outside. It's just going to be a little bit easier to pull from the outside than to try and find that end on the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull up a few yards here. Get my little sample set to the side out of the way. And then we've got our yarn here. So I'm going to start by making a slip knot, just like I normally would for any project, and slip it onto my hook. There we go. So now this is really interesting too. When I was practicing with this yarn yesterday for this class, I found that the extreme stretch really gives you a lot of variability here. Normally, when I put my yarn on a hook, I keep it about that loose on the hook. For this one, I found because it's so stretchy, you can get a little bit closer to make those stitches a little bit smaller if you want to. But when you're chaining, I would say just try and make sure that you pull those chains and those stitches through a little bit looser. If you make your later stitches a little bit tighter, that's fine, but we don't want our chains in particular to be too tight. So after we've got our slip knot on the hook, then we just go ahead and start chaining. The written pattern starts with a chain of 42, which is an even number. We don't want to do that. That would take us too long to do just the chain. So we're going to do just until we've got an even number here that looks good. So there's 1, 2. You can see I'm keeping the yarn just a little bit closer to the hook here. 3, because it does have so much great bounce to it. 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's stop at 10, 8, 9, and 10. So like I say, this pattern, you can start with any even number of chains. So the original works out to be approximately 40 inches wide. If you want it narrower, start with fewer chains. If you want it wider, start with more chains. You can literally just chain until you have the width of the blanket you want. Just make sure it's an even number and you'll be all set. So after you've done the number of chains, then it's time to start your first row. Now, when you're working into the chain, you can work into any part of the chain that you like. Sort of the standard is to go under the top 2 loops. Some people really like going under the back loop. Personally, I prefer working into the back hump, which is underneath the chains. So there's those top 2 loops that we're used to seeing. Here are those back humps underneath. This blanket is a really great place to use that technique because we aren't going to be working any border. This is a borderless, edgeless blanket. So that means the bottom of this first row is going to be the bottom edge of our blanket. So if we work into this back hump of these chains, it means that this row of, our nested V's, I was thinking those little V's that way, those will be showing up on the bottom of the blanket. It will match the top of the blanket, and it will just give it a much more finished and polished look. So to do that, let's come back over here to our hook. We're going to skip the chain closest to our hook and go to the next one. So I'm just going to insert my hook right under that back hump there and pull up my loop and make a single crochet. Just like that. So there is our first single crochet. Then we continue on with our pattern, and the pattern is chain 1, skip the next stitch, single crochet in the stitch after that. So we just make our single crochet. You can see with this great big yarn, I'm really running through the little stack of loose yarn I already pulled up here. So we've made a single crochet, a chain 1, a single crochet. That's our repeat. Chain 1, skip 1, single crochet in the next. Chain 1, skip 1, single crochet in the next. You can see with this great big hook just how big the actual stitches are. Chain 1, skip 1, single crochet in the next. On our little sample here, we're already at our last chain. On the full size blanket, of course, you'll need to repeat that quite a few more times. There we go. Pull that one through, and this is what it should look like at the end of row 1, not rounds, but rows. Single crochet, chain 1, skip 1, single crochet, chain 1, skip 1. Repeat that all the way across, and with a single crochet in that very last chain. So while we started with an even number of chains, we skipped that first chain for our turning chain. So if we were to count the actual stitches, including the chains, we would have an odd number of stitches. We chained 10, so we should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stitches. That's including the chains in between. So that is what it looks like at the end of row 1. That end really wants to flip around in there. We'll take care of that later. And now we're ready for row 2. Now, row 2 is the row that we are going to repeat all the way to the end of the blanket. But before we do that, there's one other thing I want to do. If you look at the written instructions, you'll notice it says, oh, that's for later. The written instructions say that this first row is our right side row. And if we read through, it says we want to make sure that we end on a right side row. So the easiest way to make sure that we know which side is the right side is to grab a stitch marker. Here's one right here. Let me move that off my ring so it's a little easier to see. This is a crochet stitch marker. For crochet stitch markers, they usually look like this. There's a couple different styles, but this one's probably the most popular. Looks like a little plastic safety pin. And what makes it a crochet one as opposed to a knitting one is that it does open. The knitting ones are often closed rings. But we're just going to take our stitch marker and we want to put it right on the front side of these stitches, because then we'll know this is the right side. So to do that, since we can't really pierce this yarn and I don't want to put it in the top of a stitch where it's going to get crocheted around, I'm going to pick the front, one of these front vertical, that's the word I'm looking for, vertical loops of this stitch right here in the middle. And I'm just going to drop that whole stitch like so. Get that up there, right in that stitch marker. Then I can just leave that there the whole time until I've got the length that I want. And then I'll know that the last time I work across, I should be working on this right side. Again, I think this is done just to give a little more even look to the bottom and the top. The instructions, as I say, we're going to repeat row 2 until it's the length desired. So what you could go to the 50 inches recommended in the pattern, or you can go longer or shorter. Again, whatever you like. So let's go ahead. Let me pull that back out here and we'll begin row 2. Row 2, all the rest of these rows are going to be the same. We chain 1 and turn, or you can turn and chain 1 if you prefer. Then we single crochet in that very first stitch. So we go in, pull up a loop, yarn over, and pull through 2. Then we chain 1. We skip that next chain right there and single crochet in the single crochet. Then we chain 1, skip the single crochet, skip the chain and single crochet in the single crochet. Having trouble talking tonight. It's been a long day, I guess. There we go. Then we do that again. Chain 1, skip 1, single crochet in the single crochet. So we chain 1 and skip the chains and we single crochet in the single crochets. That's about it for this one. Chain 1, skip that chain 1 below, single crochet in the single crochet. Keep having to pull up a little bit more yarn here. So this is what it should look like on a smaller scale on row 2. Our stitch marker is on the other side. We know the other side is our right side, but all the rows from here on out are going to be all the same. Pulled up some more yarn here from my ball, so we can do at least a couple more rows here together. So let's go on to row 3. Again, it's going to be exactly the same as row 2. We chain 1 and turn. I like to chain before I turn. Some people like to turn and then chain. Really doesn't matter, whatever you prefer. Go right in that first stitch for a single crochet. Chain 1, skip the chain 1, single crochet in the next. Now you'll notice how I'm holding this hook. When you have a 25 millimeter hook, I think the overhand grip is a lot easier. It's going to be a lot easier to control. It's just going to be easier on your hand. I know normally when I crochet, I am more of a pencil grip type of person, but on a hook this size, overhand grip just typically tends to be a whole lot easier to handle. You do also want to make sure your hand stays relaxed when you're working with big yarns like this. It's possible for your hands to get fatigued maybe a little bit faster than they would with smaller yarns. So it's a good idea to also take a break every once in a while and just kind of stretch your hands and make sure you aren't getting a death grip on that hook and wearing out your hand. So now we have finished row 3. We can see our stitch marker facing forward again because we're on an odd numbered row. We know this is our right sides. And you can see it just makes a really beautiful mesh. Even though it's a mesh and we're chaining one and skipping one, this fabric is still pretty dense. We can see that in the photograph on the pattern as well. So it may sound like a loose stitch pattern, but you can see it really is pretty thick right here. Let's go ahead and do one more row together. We chain one and turn. You can see this is a wonderful pattern for, Netflix night, movie night. You can definitely work this one while you're enjoying your evening with the family. So we will go in that first one and single crochet. Chain one. Skip that next chain. Make sure we come over to that single crochet. And then repeat it on again. Now, if you have trouble, if you're newer to crochet, and you have trouble saying, I can't tell, is that a chain? Is that a single crochet? Just make sure you skip one. Go at it from the top. If you don't recognize them from the front yet, you can look at the top. You want to skip the next one and go under the next one. So that is another thing that you can do to help you out here with this yarn. We chain one, skip one, single crochet in the next. Chain one, skip one, and single crochet in the next, all the way to the end. Now the instructions say to end on a right side row, so that would mean I need to make one more row to make a full-size row in this pattern. So let's do just one more row together and then we'll finish it off. I also want to take a look at the, let's go ahead and do that on this row actually. Let's look at the chart for this pattern because if you have not learned how to read charts yet, this is a fantastic one to look at to understand how crochet charts work because it's so simple. Just like our pattern, we've got chains and single crochets. So you can see here, this is where that first chain would be. We chained across all those ovals. Then we have a chain right there. That's the turning chain, the one we skipped. That little plus sign is a single crochet. You can see right there how it goes into that first chain. Then we chain one, we skip one, and single crochet in the next. Chain one, skip one, single crochet in the next. All the way across till we get to a single crochet in that last chain. Then we've got a 2. So there was row 1. We worked across this way. Row 2, we chain 1, single crochet in the single crochet, chain 1, skip the chain, single crochet, and the next single crochet. So we have a visual representation of what we're doing right inside that chart. We also have the repeat marked here because row 2, they're all the same. We'll work back and forth, of course, in different directions, but it's always going to be that row 2 repeat. Easy peasy. So let's do that one more time. We chain 1, already did that. Single crochet in that first single crochet, and then begin the repeat across the rest of the row. Chain 1, skip the single crochet, or excuse me, skip the chain, single crochet in the single crochet. Chain 1, skip the chain 1, single crochet in the single crochet. Chain 1, gotta put a little bit more yarn. I'm almost to the end of this skein, but don't panic. I've actually used this skein on another swatch. That's why. Pull up a little bit more here. There we are. Chain 1 and single crochet in that very last one. So a couple different things happening here. We have officially made enough rows because we're on the right side again. So if this was the size of, mini blanket that we wanted, maybe a little pad for something, then we can stop right here. We know on the right side because our stitch marker is right there. However, what happens if you're making the full size blanket and it's time to add another skein of yarn? So we're going to go ahead and pretend I'm going to cut this one. I'm going to make sure I leave a decent length here, even though we aren't weaving our ends in the standard way. We still want to have a little bit of length to play with. I'm just going to cut right through. You can see those great ends right there. So fuzzy. Okay, so let's pretend that I've been crocheting along and I finished this skein of yarn. Lucky me, it happened at the end of the row. Could have happened in the middle of the row. Doesn't really matter. When it's time to add the next skein of yarn, you've got a couple of options. You can sew those ends together and just continue crocheting them as one strand, or we can join this next yarn with our next stitch and then weave in and sew down both of those ends. I'm going to show you how to sew the yarn here in a few minutes. So for now, let's pretend we wanted to do it the second way, where we just join our new yarn with a stitch. To do that, what I would do is I want to go back to the last full stitch that I made. Just like I say, it just happens to be here on the end. It could have been any of the other stitches in the blanket. I'm going to insert my hook, pull my loop, and normally I would yarn over again and pull through to finish, but I've run out of yarn. It's time to add the new skein. So to do that, I'm just going to lay that yarn over the hook. Make sure you leave a few inches. Still want to have a tail end here. And pull that loop through. Okay. Now I'm going to leave both of these tails of ends of the yarn just hanging out here on the side. And then I can just continue crocheting like I normally would. I just tend to hold on them really tightly while I do that chain one. And then I can turn and keep crocheting and just weave and sew down these ends when I'm all done. Again, it doesn't matter at what point in the blanket. You're probably going to have somewhere you get lucky and it happens on the side, somewhere it happens right in the middle of a row. But that is a great way to add that next skein of yarn that you'll need when you're making, something bigger than our little swatch here. Now, I did see a question come up about how much would the blanket weigh if you made the full-sized blanket. Now, assuming, which is probably a big assumption, but we'll do a little assuming right now, that we're going to use the full 10 balls of yarn because, there's probably going to be a little couple inches at the end of each skein that maybe, we don't use or that get woven in, or maybe, wasn't enough to do a whole row. So we set aside a little bit of that last skein. But each skein is 8.8 ounces. I've pulled out my calculator here off screen. And here, we'll go ahead and pull it up on screen. Oh, it's too shiny. Doesn't work. Okay, 8.8 ounces times 10 balls would be, well, that's an easy one, 88 ounces. Divided by 16, that would be 5.5 pounds. I think my math is on there right on that one. Somebody correct me in the chat if my math was wrong. But the finished blanket as written would be about 5.5 pounds. Now, I don't know if that's heavy enough to be an official, quote unquote weighted blanket, but it is a pretty good weight. And I think it would be really calming for a lot of people. Like I said, I don't know if it's, therapeutically heavy, but it is a heavier blanket. And you could certainly, if you wanted to make it even heavier, just work single crochets across rather than chaining one and skipping one. That's going to add a little bit more yarn and you could get a couple more balls of it and make it even heavier and denser, or just make it even bigger. So I don't know if it's designed to be a weighted blanket, but it's, 5.5 pounds. It's starting to get up there a little bit. So now we're going to say we have finished our whole blanket. It's time to take care of our ends. We've got that last end here on our last stitch. So I'm just going to yarn over and pull that little tail end through. Give that a little tug. And now we need to secure all the rest of our ends. And this is where the sewing needle and thread come in that I was talking to you about. Now, I know it sounds crazy, especially with a white thread, right? I've got white thread. It's just what I happen to have. I don't do a whole lot of sewing myself, but a little bit. So I grabbed some white. Doesn't match this color at all, right? This stuff is so squishy. Here it is. I didn't cut it off yet because I was afraid I wasn't going to be able to find it. Here's the little practice swatch that I was working with to get used to the yarn last night. And this is an end that I sewed down. I haven't trimmed off the rest of it yet, but I just want to show you right there. This is with the exact same white thread. I just sewed through these two layers right here. It feels really nice and secure. So then I would simply Cut that end off really close. And then let that pull and tuck right back under that stitch. So let's go ahead and do that together now. I'm going to pull back over this one, and you do the same thing to the very starting tail, of course. And I get my needle back here. I did pre-thread it. Didn't think you guys wanted to watch me try and thread my needle for 15 minutes. That's always the hardest part, right? Okay, so before we start sewing, I don't want to just, sew it willy-nilly, right? That's going to be really obvious. So I don't have a yarn needle big enough for this, to weave in the ends. I'm just going to go ahead and use my fingers. So let's go ahead and take this first end here, get that extra yarn out of the way. I will just start tucking it behind some stitches. You can see with that 25mm crochet hook, we've got enough room to just use our fingers and start pulling it through. So the first one, you don't want to pull too tight because then it'll pull it down. Just pull really gently, just like if you had it on a yarn needle. Weave it under some stitches till you get it away from the edge a little bit here. So I'm going to continue to weave it through just a couple stitches here. I want to find a place where I think it's going to be easy to hide that end. So maybe a place where we've got lots of sort of overlapping strands of yarn. This looks like a good spot right over here. So I'm going to pull that through, and you can see it roughs up a little bit as you're doing, but that's okay. We're going to cut this off again. Now I've got it right about where I want it. This seems like a good place to hide that sewing. So let me get my needle here. There we go. Didn't want to come off the table. So we find that cut end, and then we decide which strand we want to sew it to. Just kind of look around, see, okay, this one seems to be on the inside. I think this is a good one to hide it with. So let me pull it up real close here to the camera so we've got a good view. I'm going to pinch those two strands together. Here's my tail. Here's the strand inside the blanket. I'm just going to pinch those together. I have thread on my needle with a knot at the end. I don't know if you guys can see that right there. So now what I want to do is just go through both of those layers. See if we can get that close enough. Great big yarn, but tiny little needle. There we go. We just want to pull that right through both layers here. And if you pull too hard, you could probably pull that knot through. So don't pull too hard, just pull till it wants to stop. And then I just go back exactly the other direction. Maybe, 2 or 3 millimeters away. But basically, I just go back and forth. Nothing fancy. I'm not really going around it at all or anything like that. I'm just going back and forth through those two strands of yarn. Let's get centered again there. So you can do this as many times as makes you feel comfortable. I would, recommend more than just a couple. You want to do it a few times here. Probably the more you anticipate the blanket getting sort of tossed around and loved by your family, the more you want to stitch it down. You just want to take your time and go back and forth and back and forth. As you can see, it really does just kind of disappear right into the yarn. If you wanted to, if you're worried about it, if you're maybe using a really dark color, then finding a matching yarn would definitely be advisable. But for our demo today, it's a little better, of course, if it's actually a little bit more visible. So I've just gone back and forth and back and forth. And now I can tell that these do not want to come apart. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a couple of knots right here in my thread. I almost said yarn. This is thread. And this is just your standard sewing thread, all purpose. Coats thread is my favorite. And we just put a few knots right in there. Kind of hard to see, I know, but make a tiny little knot at your thread. Try and keep it at the surface of the yarn. I find putting my finger over it helps. Not great for demoing, but makes the yarn nice and tight the thread nice and tight to the yarn there. There we go. And then just like trimming off our yarn, you can go ahead and trim off that thread. Set that little needle somewhere safe. So now we can come back to our project here. It's nice and secure right there. It's really genuinely not going anywhere. So now I just want to cut this off close, not too close. I want to leave maybe not quite half an inch, we'll say, and just trim that down again. And then we can just let that end work its way right into the blanket. It's right there if you look very closely, but you really have to look closely to find it, and with a little bit of use and wear here, Let's see. Yep. It's completely disappeared up into those stitches. So then, of course, you would just do the same thing with the other end. So again, this is your chance to ask any questions you have on this pattern. Let's see. Trying to think if there's anything we missed. We've got our right side here marked. Want to make sure you finish on a right side edge. And of course, sew in those ends. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to ask some more questions, and we'll go ahead and sew in our last end here. When I do thread my needle, I like to make it nice and long so I can hopefully get a couple of knots out of each strand, but I just thread it, make sure it's doubled, and then with the two ends here together is where I tie our knots. So let's see. Okay, we've got a few questions here, but they're flashing by too fast for me. Allie, can you help me out, please?
Absolutely. So Tracy wants to know, why do you have to keep track of the right side and wrong side, and does it matter?
You know what? I did not design this one. This one was designed by the Yarn Inspirations design team, and they are absolutely fabulous. I think it is just because they wanted sort of that top edge to, when we make single crochets, sorry, let me start this over. When we make single crochets, that top V, the one closest to us, the front loop, if you will, is a little bit lower than the back loop. And so this can create sort of almost like a frame look to it. And then I imagine they wanted the bottom to match that as much as possible. Let's see what it looks like from the back. And you can see this is what it looks like from the quote unquote wrong side. So personally, I think they both look fantastic. You can see how that top edge does look just a little bit different. Does this one look wrong? Not to me. I think it's beautiful. I think it's a very reversible blanket, but that is how they wrote out the pattern. So that's how I wanted to teach it. I really do think, like I said, I think both sides of this really are quite pretty. I think honestly, the right side is more determined by that last row than the first row, just because of that tilted issue. But I really think either side look fantastic. So if you like the other side better, you can call the other side the right side. It's up to you.
Amazing. And Pamela wants to know if this yarn unravels at all.
I have not had a chance to wash this one yet, so I can't speak to that. Let's look at the care instructions together here and see what it says. Care instructions on reverse side of label. Well, that's why I haven't looked at it yet. Let's turn it over and see here. Oh, okay. It's all the way down here at the bottom. So it says wash in water on the delicate setting, tumble dry, low heat, delicate. Do not iron or press. Do not dry clean. So it says you can wash it and dry it on delicate, on gentle. I would probably put it in a very large lingerie type mesh bag if you have one, just because I wouldn't want it, or at least very least wash it by itself so that it doesn't get snagged on anything else. But I will say the outer portion seems pretty solid. So Allie, I don't know, I'm sorry, can you speak to that a little bit more as a Yarn Inspirations person?
Yeah, I mean, I think that overall this yarn would wash pretty well. And I think really just making sure that your ends are woven in as much as possible, because like Tamara said, you can't weave in your ends like you would traditionally. So making sure that you really secure those.
Yeah.
After you stitch your project.
Yeah. One other thing that you could do too, I was thinking, is if you were very, if you intended this to get a lot of wear and tear, what you may want to do is at the end, after you cut it off, something like some Aleene's tacky glue. That is a really popular one for crafters. I'm sure you can find it at your Michaels, along with a lot of other great craft glues. There are some glues that are meant to stay soft with fabric, and having a little bit of glue on the end, I haven't tried it yet, but I think it might be something that helps a little bit if you are nervous about it coming undone. And like I say, it's something you think you're going to get a lot of use and love. It's very squishy, so I cannot imagine not wanting to cover up in this thing. It's so soft and squishy. Were there any other questions I could answer?
Amazing. Question here. The first row has a bit more spacing than the other. I think they're talking maybe about the gaps that you're seeing with the first row.
Yeah. Yep.
They want to know if you would advise crocheting it a bit tighter, or what your advice around that would be.
I think It is the nature of the pattern. Absolutely. I see it too. It was on both my swatches. I definitely noticed it right there. You can see just a little bit more right there as well. Yes, you could crochet that bottom row a little bit tighter. You just want to make sure it's not so tight, that it pulls in this way. Another alternative would be you could add some really fun fringe, or you could go back and work a border around it. Let's pull up some yarn here and see what happens. Sometimes working a border into these stitches actually makes them a little bit more distinct. So this may backfire, but we've got some extra time. So let's try it out. I'm going to pretend I've worked my way around and I'm ready to work into that bottom row. Or maybe I decided to start in the bottom of the first row here. So just like if I were adding a new yarn, basically it's the same thing. I'm going to go into the stitch. This is another way to add more yarn than the other two we've already gone over here. And just go ahead and pull up a loop and then start crocheting with it. And then you can just weave in that end again at the end. So we'll chain one. We'll try single crocheting right in the bottom of this first single crochet. And then we'll crochet right in that chain one space, not into the chain one itself, but into the space. And let's see if this fills it in. Sometimes, like I say, sometimes it backfires. It really just depends on the pattern. And a lot of times you just have to take the stitches to see what's going to happen. So I'm working into the bottoms of the single crochets, and I'm just working around the chains that we skipped as if it was a chain one space here. So let's do this last, not quite last one, excuse me, but it's enough to look at here. So I don't know. I do think it almost made those gaps a little bit more obvious for this one. So if you really wanted to avoid that, now that we've tried a couple different things here, I think the best thing might be to actually work the first row as a row of solid single crochet and then repeat row two. So let's try that on a tiny little swatch here. Let me set these other two out of the way. I've got a little bit more yarn here. So we'll do that with just a few stitches here. Get my slip knot on the hook, and we'll chain 6. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So I still want to start, because we need the stitch multiple for row 2 and beyond. For row 1 here, we still want to start with an even number, skip the chain closest to the hook. Still want to work in the back hump because that's still going to be our finished edge. But now, instead of chaining 1 and skipping 1, I'm just going to single crochet all the way across for row 1. And I think if you did it this way, you'd probably want to work your last row all in single crochet too. But again, you can take a look at it and kind of decide in the moment which look you like best. So since I chained 6 and I skipped the turning chain, we should have a total of 5 single crochets here for row 1. Just our tiny little sample here. So now, with that established, I'm going to go ahead and jump back into our written pattern with row 2. So we'll chain 1 and turn, single crochet in that first stitch, and then chain 1 and skip the next stitch in this case, and single crochet in the next. Then we can chain 1, skip the next one, and because it's our little sample here, we are at the end. So it's kind of hard to tell from 2 rows. Let's go ahead and do another one. We'll chain 1 and turn, single crochet in that first one. And then, like I say, it's all row 2 from here. Chain 1, skip the chain 1, single crochet in the next single crochet. Pull up a little bit more yarn because you've used it all again. There we go. Chain 1, skip 1, single crochet in the last for our little swatch. And now we can take a look at what that looks like a little bit. So there you can see that really does fill in those gaps at the bottom. So if that bothers you, that could be a good solution. Working that very first row, just solid single crochet, and then jump into the pattern on row 2. And that, I think, will give you that more of that finished edge you're looking for. For the last row, of course, it should be on this side because it's the right side, but we'll pretend it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. It's whatever you like. We'll chain 1, and let's try working a row of single crochet all the way across and see if we like that or if we like it better ending on this sort of row. So we'll single crochet in that first one, and now I'm going to try single crocheting in that chain one space, doing a whole experiment series this row. Then we'll single crochet in the next single crochet. And then in this next one, rather than single crocheting in the chain space, I'm going to try crocheting into the chain itself. And we'll see how that looks. See if we like one over the other. Because you can always, this is a really great yarn. It frogs beautifully. Don't be afraid to pull your stitches back out. Do a little experimentation. Have some fun with it. I'll single crochet in that last stitch. And now we can compare the looks there. So if we did a first row of single crochet and a last row of solid single crochet with no chain one, skip ones, this is what it looks like if we work into that chain space. And this is what it looks like right there if we work into the chain itself. Bizarrely, I think working into the chain itself actually kind of maintains the look of the rest of the pattern somehow. I don't know why, but it seems to kind of maintain the look of that mesh a little bit better. But either one would work very well. They both give a really nice finished edge, and that, well, we're on the wrong side now. I think if you did the full row of single crochet, the right side and wrong side will actually matter a little bit more, because that whole solid row does look a little different from the back. But you could definitely just start with a row of single crochet. Still want to make sure that you chain a multiple of 2, because we need to have that stitch multiple, an odd number, for the rest of those rows. But now you've got a couple of different alternatives to change up the look a little bit. And then, of course, like I say, if you really want to put a border around the whole thing, you can really get some fancy, bring in some other colors and do all kinds of extra things, make some fringe, whatever you like to do. Any other questions?
Let me see.
Keep this guy on here in case we want to do some more to him.
Is it possible to finish with to do a border on just the sides?
Yes, I have seen patterns that do that before. It's a couple more ends to weave in, so it's up to you. Definitely you could work just along the sides and then cut those ends and weave them in how you otherwise would. If you wanted to go all the way around the whole thing again, which might really be a great place also to use that solid single crochet, because it's going to give you a really nice border at the top and bottom, then you could crochet into those sides as well. So let's go ahead and do that here on our little swatch where the yarn's still attached. Let's pretend I decided I wanted to work all the way around. I've got some extra yarn. I really want to give it a finished edge. So we'll say I worked my way across the top and now I'm at this side. More likely than not, you're going to want to chain 1, possibly 2. 1 works just as well. Gives you a little bit of height so you can start working across here. And then, since these are single crochet rows, the height of a single crochet, right? They're single crochets and chains, but they're no taller than a single crochet. We're just going to work 1 single crochet into the side of each row. On our little swatch here, we only made, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. So we'll only need 4 single crochets along the side. Now, different people like to do it differently. And frankly, I like to do it differently depending on the project I'm working on. Again, I tend to take a few stitches, see what I like, pull it back out, and then go with the version I liked best. With this yarn, because it is so thick, I'm going to say we're going to go right in the center of this stitch so that I've got 2 loops on top of my hook and just do a single crochet right in there. This one, I want to make sure that I come down to the side of that stitch here, that I don't accidentally just work into the top of it again. Go into the side there, pull up our loop, and single crochet. Same thing on down. Just want to try and be as consistent as you can when you're working into the edge. We come to that very first row right there. Single crochet into the side of that one. And there you go. So if you wanted to break your yarn and weave in your end there, you could. Otherwise, you can chain 1 again. When 1 seems to work pretty well for this yarn, but if you want to do 2 again, you could. And then right on back into that, I guess would be the bottom of the bottom row now. Sometimes if you want a sharper turn, let's try it with a chain 2. Sometimes I prefer a chain 2. Again, since we're playing with the pattern, it's kind of whatever you like. So there's a chain 2 before we go back in there. It leaves a little bit of a gap, but I find a chain 2 creates sort of a sharper squared off corner. So now we're just crocheting into the bottom, but you've already seen me do that. So now here is single crochets along the side. Again, we just want to have one single crochet in the side of each row. If you do a chain 2 there, it might leave a little bit of a gap in the corner, but it does create a really nice squared off edge as well. So one of those things where you can pick. And if you actually wanted to add a fancier border, you'd probably want to add a really simple round of single crochets first, and having that extra little space at the corner to work a fancier corner into can be really handy as well. So is there another question I can answer?
I think that is about it.
Excellent. All right. So I think we've covered it. We talked about the pattern. We talked about the chart. Again, it's a wonderful pattern to learn how to read charts with because you've got the written instructions. You can kind of look back and forth. And it's just such a lovely pattern for this yarn. And hopefully some of the tips and things we've given you today will make it a little bit easier for you to work with. Once again, that was Bernat Plush Big. We can go ahead and come back to the other camera. Move this one gently out of the way. There we go. Didn't want to swing you, make everybody a little bit seasick. Once again, that pattern, if you want to look it up, is the Bernat Mesh Crochet Blanket. And I've been Tamara Kelly from Moogly, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thanks so much, everybody.
Amazing. Have a good one, everyone.
Bye-bye.